guys, welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be building a little tiny corner of a tavern with a few dishes on the table. I'm starting out with some craft wood. This is 1/16 of an inch thick, and I'm going to make this the floor. I'm drawing out where I want the floorboards to be because it's hard for me to just cut these strips and then try and like puzzle piece them together. So if I do this, I already know how they're going to fit together, and then all I need to do is glue them down to this paper board. And I'm gluing them in place with some tacky glue. I roughed them up a little bit by scraping my X-Acto knife over them, and I also sanded them down with some sandpaper. Then I went in and darkened the spaces in between the floorboards and some of the grooves with an ink pen, but I felt like I overdid it with that a little bit, so I started taking it away over time, little by little, and tried to diminish it because I felt like it stood out. I'm using some acrylic paint on the floors, but I've mixed it with this stuff that I got from the craft store that turns acrylic paint into wood stain, and I'll have that linked down in the supply list in the description box for you guys. Now I'm darkening these little dots that I made in the wood where the nails holding the floorboard down would be. We're gonna make some tiny little tankards to go on the table in this little corner, and I'm using some wooden dowels for this. I just approximated the size that they should be by eye, and then I chopped them down. I didn't want to show sawing it because it shakes my desk too much, but you get the picture. I sanded the edges to make sure they were nice and neat. Now I'm drawing on the lines that I'm gonna carve to make it look like this was a bunch of pieces of wood that were put together to make the mug. And then I'm gonna very, very carefully carve down on those lines with my X-Acto knife. It was a little hard to catch that on camera, but this was the safest way I could do it. Now I'm drilling a hole on the inside of the mug, and I'm gonna have to widen it a little bit because I didn't have a drill bit that was exactly the right size for what I was trying to do, but I can use my X-Acto knife to very, very carefully just hollow it out a little bit more. Now I can move on to staining the wood. I'm just using the same batch of wood stain that I made earlier, but I adjust the color a little bit based on whatever item I'm using the wood stain on. To make the bands that are going to go around the little mugs, I'm using some painter's tape and cutting it into as thin of a strip as I can manage. I still felt like it was a little too thick once I wrapped the first strip around one of the mugs, so I went in with my X-Acto knife and tried to like carve it down to a little bit thinner size. Next, I'm using a thin sheet of plastic, and I've drawn on some little handles for the mugs, and I'm just gonna cut those out and attach them with super glue. I'm painting them with some acrylic paint. This is a matte black paint that I'm just using as like a base because I want this all to be metal, but if there are any places that the metal doesn't cover, I don't want it to show plastic underneath, so at least it'll show black. I'm using some embellishing wax that is pewter colored. The little tube that I have of this stuff is very dried out, which made it a little bit harder to apply. I guess it kind of added to the whole rustic look of the thing, so I'm not too mad at it. I shaved down the end of a glue stick just so I'd have something to fill up the inside of the mug with, and then I'm gonna use some UV resin and mix that with white and a separate batch of yellow pastel, and then I'm gonna put that inside the cups and use my ultraviolet light to cure it. The yellow pretty much got covered completely up, so it was kind of an optional step, but I didn't know that it was going to be covered up when I did it, so it's okay. Before the resin was fully cured, I moved it around to create lumps to make it look like foam coming over the edge of the mug. Cheers! I don't want to build the walls and ceiling or think about the background of this room box corner too much, So I'm just gonna make a bunch of boxes And these are going to be all of the crates and supplies that are in the corner of the tavern. That way I have a little bit of a backdrop for what I'm really interested in, which is the tabletop, but it's also going to tell the story of this area being a tavern. I'm using the exact same techniques that I used for the floor to create these boxes, and I stained them with some more of the leftover wood stain. And I'm doing a slightly different technique to make a barrel to go in the corner. I wanted to try to make an actual barrel shape using wood, so I roughly carved out these little spaces along the edges so that it would be able to curve, and then I scored the wood and I let it soak in some water overnight. That way I could bend it a little more easily. Next, I made a barrel-shaped mold to go inside of it using some pink insulation foam, and I used super glue to glue the wood to the outside of the foam. Then I used some wire to kind of twist and compress all of the wood around the mold shape, and then I heated it up with my heat gun. This is like a replay of what it would look like. I'm not doing it on camera because I was gonna burn off my fingers. After it was all dry, I cut away the wire, and then I used some more of the tape to make bands to go around this the same way I did for the mugs. And then I just stained it with some more wood stain, and I went ahead and stained all of the boxes as well. And then I let those dry overnight. Once they were dry, I sanded them down and reapplied a little bit more paint. And once I felt like they were sufficiently weathered, I was all done with all of the little props for the background. I'm making a really simple table to go in here. By the way, all of the wood that I'm using is exactly the same wood that I used on the floor, but I changed the way that it looks based on the wood tint that I've been using, the wood stain that I told you guys about. And I cut out this wood table, and then I tried painting in a little more wood grain on this one, but that's pretty much the only difference to any of the other wood stuff that I've done so far. And I quickly made a little stool to go next to it. Now it's time to move on to the whole reason that I wanted to make this diorama to begin with, which is I wanted to try out making some little foods, especially in this scale, because all of the food that I've made has been in 1/12 scale. And before, when I made food, I used air dry clay, and I tried to make everything look as realistic as possible straight out of the mold. But with this one, I wanted to try and just sculpt it out of green stuff and see if I could paint realistic food without actually making it out of like translucent clay or anything like that. So that's what I did. I sculpted some little chicken to go on a tray, and I sculpted a wedge of cheese and some little herbs to go around it. And once I felt like they looked realistic enough in the sculpture itself, I let them cure overnight and then painted them with some acrylic model paint. I was pleasantly surprised. After covering all of the green, which took a few layers to do, I was able to kind of paint it to look like actual food. It helps that the green stuff is so good at holding on to any texture that you put on it while it's curing. I used a tiny little sponge to make the chicken skin look more chicken skinny, and I was expecting for it not to show up in the end, but all of the little texture that I put on there with the sponge still showed, and I think that actually is kind of crazy. I made a couple of little lettuce leaves and like herbs to go around it too, and I wasn't sure whether I was going to use them or not, but in the end I did end up dressing the little tray for the chicken with them. And this is pretty much the finished result. I'm going to add everything to the table, and hopefully you guys enjoy. I want to say a quick shout out to Inez E, KNZ, Grouchy Old Man, Fatal Gift, Pat M, Suki T, Lizzie B, Ryan R, Cheryl R, Julia ST, Fred C, Isaac W, Lori R, Cheryl F, Gabriel K, and Awkward Burp. Thank you guys for being patrons over on Patreon. If you guys want to get patterns and stuff that you see me use on here that I just create for some of these builds, you can get them for download on my Patreon. And I will see you guys in the next video. Hopefully you enjoyed this one. We're sticking with this fantasy series for a while because that's just what my mind is stuck on. So this was all kind of practice for the next build, which is going to be way more intense and have a lot more food in it. And I wanted to figure this whole food thing out before I even attempted that one. So hopefully you guys stay tuned. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.